AT Consideration 1 ADL by Lizzy and Kara Hallgren for SED 379, Fall 2012. Analysis of students' abilities, physical abilities, and limitations. This is Max. Max has a difficult time properly gripping and pulling objects for a long period of time. His grip is weak, which makes learning to use a spoon and fork difficult. Max is toilet trained. He needs assistance transferring on and off the toilet and needs something to stabilize him while he is sitting. He has low muscle tone in his trunk and legs, particularly the lower parts of his legs. Max needs assistance when dressing and undressing. He needs support, including a shoulder belt on his wheelchair, and he needs support when he sits on the floor. Max is unable to bear weight and is unstable in a sitting position without support. Max has movement in his upper extremities, hands and arms with fluctuations in muscle tone. He has limitations placed on his range of motion. For his right elbow, Max has a 130-degree range and only 25 degrees on his left elbow. With his right arm, he is able to cross midline. Max uses a wheelchair for mobility. He cannot independently move his wheelchair. Max can notice people within about 5 feet of him and cannot discriminate details in the environment. Max must be placed about 3 feet from the television to see, and when reading books, he must have the book approximately 10 inches from his face to recognize pictures and big print text. He has progressed in pointing to about 15 pictures that are concrete representations of common objects, and few actions when the teacher says, "Show me," and the action. At home, visual symbols are being placed on everyday objects. Max's cerebral palsy affects his ability to articulate words clearly. Speaking has always been a difficulty for him. He uses about 30 words verbally, but they are only understandable to those who are familiar with his words. He uses facial expressions to convey his likes and dislikes. Max has about 5 to 10 second delay for answering questions with choices verbally or with pointing. He can vocalize yes and no to indicate what he wants. His vision abilities are uncertain due to a lack of communication. Analysis of tasks demands snack activity. Using the restroom. The activity requires the student to see where to line up, where the bathroom is, and how to open a stall. The student can line up in a line and see where the bathroom is, and the student can observe if someone is in the stall. The activity requires the student to open and close the door, adjust clothing, and flush. The student can open and close the door and can flush the toilet. The student cannot adjust their clothes to go to the bathroom. The activity requires the student to sit down on the toilet. The student can sit on the toilet. The student cannot sit on the toilet without support. The activity requires the student to move from the class to the restroom and move in and out of the stall. The student cannot move from the class to the bathroom without assistance. The student cannot move in and out of the bathroom without assistance. Washing hands. The activity requires the student to know where the sink is, where the soap is, and where the towels are. The student can determine the location of essential materials to wash hands. The activity requires the student to turn on the faucet, press the soap dispenser, and grab the towels. The student can turn on a faucet depending on the handles. The student can grab the towels and can press on the soap dispenser. The activity requires the student to sit in an upright position. The activity requires the student to lean over to put hands under the water and lean for the soap dispensers and towels. The student can reach with his right arm for the essential hand washing materials, but may have a difficult time washing his left hand. The activity requires the student to move from the sink to the towels. The student cannot move himself across the bathroom. Read the recipe and gather materials. The activity requires the student to read the instructions and know where the materials are in the classroom. The student cannot read the small print instructions from more than 5 feet away. The activity requires the student to hold the recipe, grab the materials, place them on the table, and navigate through the cabinet. The student can place the materials on the table. The student may have difficulty holding onto the recipe and grabbing the materials. The activity requires the student to sit at the table in an upright position. The activity requires the student to rotate, to grab materials, and lean forward to reach for the materials. The student can lean forward with their
right arm to reach for the materials. The student cannot support himself in a seated position. The activity requires the student to move materials from the kitchen to the table and move around the kitchen to gather materials. The student cannot move in the room independently. Peel and cut the fruit. The activity requires the student to watch where to cut the knife and feeling your knife cut through the fruit. The student can see when the fruit has been sliced. The activity requires the student to grasp the knife and cutting it in a sawing motion. The student cannot saw the fruit and may have difficulty holding the knife. The activity requires the student to sit at the table in an upright position. The activity requires the student to stand up or against the counter. The student cannot stand at the counter. The student can sit at the table and cut the fruit with a rocking motion. Pour Splenda and lemon water into a bowl. The activity requires the student to measure the water as well as where to tear the package. The student cannot read the small measurements on a measuring cup. The activity requires the student to manipulate the scissors or tearing the packet, and they need to open the bottle and pour. The student cannot open the package without some assistance. The student cannot make the twisting motion to open the bottle. The activity requires the student to sit at the table in an upright position. The activity requires the student to lean over the bowl and the sink to pour the contents. The student can lean out with their right arm to pour the contents. The activity requires the student to move between the table and the sink. The student needs assistance moving between the two locations. Mix fruit into the water mixture. The activity requires the student to watch where they drop the fruit. The student can take note of the fruit being poured into the bowl. The activity requires the student to stir in the ingredients and pick up the fruit to place in the bowl. The student must also be able to hold the spoon. The student can stir the ingredients in the mixture. The student may have difficulty picking up the smaller fruit pieces. The activity requires the student to sit at the table in an upright position. The activity requires the student to rotate between the bowl and cutting board of the fruit. The student may be limited in his rotation of his body. Pour the mixture into the ice pot mold. The activity requires the student to know where the mold is and knowing where the bowl is. The student must recognize when the molds are full and when the spoon is filled to the top. The student can recognize the placement of the mold and the bowl. The activity requires the student to hold the spoon, scoop up the mixture, and pour the mixture into the molds. The student cannot pour the mixture into the molds. The activity requires the student to sit at the table in an upright position. The activity requires the student to rotate between the mixture and the molds. The student cannot effectively reach for the mixture and pour it into the molds. Place in freezer until frozen. The activity requires the student to see open space in the freezer. The student can see if there is room for the molds. The activity requires the student to hold the molds, open the freezer door, and lift the molds into the freezer. The student can hold the molds. The student cannot open the freezer door. The activity requires the student to lean in to grab the molds off the table and lean to place them in the freezer. The student can reach for the mold trays. The student cannot place them in the freezer unless it is near the bottom of the freezer. The activity requires the student to move from the table to the freezer. The student cannot move to the freezer without assistance. Take out of the freezer and eat. The activity requires the student to see when the ice pops are frozen and knowing when napkins are placed. The student can determine where the napkins are and they can determine if the ice pops are frozen. The activity requires the student to grab the snack out of the freezer, removing the snack from the mold and opening and closing the freezer door. The student can open and close the freezer door. The student cannot take the snack out of the mold. The activity requires the student to lean into the freezer to grab the snack. The student can reach for the snack with their right arm. The activity requires the student to sit at the table in an upright position. The activity requires the student to move between the table and freezer. The student needs assistance moving between the refrigerator and the table. Cleaning up materials. The activity requires the student to know which dishes are dirty and clean, and where the sink and trash are located. The student will need to know where to place leftover food. The student can determine between clean and dirty and knows the location of the sink and trash. The activity requires the student to grab materials and place them in the sink, and the student must throw away the popsicle sticks and napkins. The student can grab the larger objects. The student can throw their trash away. The student cannot manipulate the smaller utensils. The activity requires the student to lean over and place items in the sink. The student must also be able to rotate between the dirty dishes and placing them in the sink or trash. The student can reach over to place the items in the sink. The activity requires the student to move to the sink and the trash. The student needs assistance moving to the sink and trash can. Washing hands. The activity requires the student to know where the sink is, where the soap is, and where the towels are. The student can determine the location of essential materials to wash hands. The activity requires the student to turn on the faucet, press the soap dispenser, and grab the towels. The student can turn on a faucet depending on the handles. The student can grab the towels and can press on the soap dispenser. The activity requires the student to sit in an upright position. The activity requires the student to lean over to put hands under the water and lean for the soap dispensers and towels. The student can reach with his right arm for the essential hand washing materials but may have a difficult time washing his left hand. The activity requires the student to move from the sink to the towels. The student cannot move himself across the bathroom.
Gathering materials for the next activity. The activity requires students to know what is needed for the next activity and reading what the next activity is. The student can hear the instructions given to them. The activity may require the student to grab the necessary materials. Depending on the activity, whether the student can perform the task is unknown. The activity may require the student to lean into shelves and rotate between the materials on his desk. Depending on the activity, whether the student can perform the task is unknown. The activity may require the student to move around the classroom. The student cannot move around the classroom without assistance. Discrepancy analysis and problem identification.
Sitting upright at a table. The feature makes it easier to sit upright. Using the restroom. The feature makes it easier to see where the bathroom is located in the school. The feature makes it easier to see where the toilet is and whether or not it is occupied. The feature makes it easier to open the bathroom door, unfastening and fastening clothing. The feature makes it easier to position oneself on the toilet. The feature transforms walking to the washroom into being wheeled to the restroom. Washing hands. The feature makes it easier to see where the sink, soap, and towels are located. The feature makes it easier to see if the water is running. The feature makes it easier to turn on the water, press the soap dispenser, and pull down the towels. The feature makes it easier to reach for the towels, soap, and water. The feature transforms walking around the restroom into being wheeled around the restroom. Read the recipe and gather materials. The feature makes it easier to perceive the instructions and seeing where the materials are located in the classroom. The feature makes it easier to hold the recipe, grabbing the materials needed for the activity. The feature makes it easier to reach and rotate to grab the materials. The feature transforms walking into being wheeled around the classroom to grab the necessary materials. Peel and cut the fruit. The feature makes it easier to see where the fruit is located and where the peel is opening. The feature makes it easier to hold a knife, to hold the fruit in place, and peel the fruit. The feature makes it easier to reach to grab the fruit and to throw away the peel. Pour Splenda and lemon water into a bowl. The feature makes it easier to see where the tear is located on the package. The feature makes it easier to perceive where the bowl is in location to the package and water bottle. The feature makes it easier to hold the package, tear the package open, and twist the water bottle cap open and close. The feature makes it easier to pour the package and water into the bowl. The feature transforms walking into being wheeled between the table and the sink. Mix the fruit into the water mixture. The feature makes it easier to see where the fruit is and seeing if the fruit is mixed into the mixture well. The feature makes it easier to grab fruit and place it into the mixture. The feature makes it easier to stir the fruit together. The feature makes it easier to rotate between the fruit and the mixture. Pour the mixture into the iced hot mold. The feature makes it easier to perceive where the mixture is located in relation to the mold. The feature makes it easier to perceive if the molds are filled to the top. The feature makes it easier to hold the bowl while pouring the contents into the mold. The feature makes it easier to rotate your arm to pour in the contents. Place in the freezer until frozen. The feature makes it easier to perceive open space in the freezer, seeing that the molds are leveled and seeing if the ice caps have frozen. The feature makes it easier to hold the mold trays and to open and close the freezer door. The feature makes it easier to reach into the freezer to place molds. The feature transforms walking into being wheeled around the classroom. Take out the freezer and eat. The feature makes it easier to perceive that the ice caps are frozen and where the molds are located and where they can be placed once taken out of the freezer. The feature makes it easier to hold the molds, take them out of the mold. The feature makes it easier to open and close the freezer door. The feature makes it easier to reach in and out of the freezer. The feature makes it easier to rotate between the mold and the plate to place a snack. The feature transforms walking into being wheeled around the classroom. Cleaning up materials. The feature makes it easier to see where the sink and trash are located, seeing what items are clean and dirty. The feature makes it easier to grab the napkins and dishes. The feature makes it easier to reach and rotate to place the items in the sink or trash. The feature transforms walking into being wheeled around the classroom. Washing hands. The feature makes it easier to see where the sink, soap, and towels are located. The feature makes it easier to see if the water is running. The feature makes it easier to turn on the water, press the soap dispenser, and pull down the towels. The feature makes it easier to reach for the towels, soap, and water. The feature transforms walking around the restroom into being wheeled around the restroom. Gather materials for the next activity. The feature makes it easier to perceive what the next activity will be and what materials are necessary. The feature makes it easier to grab the materials for the next activity. The feature makes it easier to reach and rotate depending on where the materials are located. The feature transforms walking into being wheeled around the classroom to get the materials.
Assistive technology solutions.
Max will need a wheelchair in order to move around the classroom. To do so, he will need an aid to assist him around the room. Max will also need these straps in order to help him sit upright in a chair during the activity.
In order for Max to collect materials around the classroom, he'll need a swivel table. This allows him to put materials on while he's moving around the classroom, and it allows him to move the table away during activities to have full access.
Max will use a reacher in order to gather materials needed for the desired activity.
The GoTalk 9 Plus board will allow Max to be able to communicate with his peers and has removable slips so he can change what he says up to 5 different panels. And simply pressing the button, it says aloud what the word is that would match up with. This can be changed to use for the snack recipe or for the game activity. It's difficult to make the twisting motion when you're opening a bottle. So instead we use this bottle opener that will place the cap into the middle of its ridges and we twist the handle completely around instead of having to work with tiny little twisting motions. We'll also use the soft touch scissors, which has a spring-loaded action, so there's not as much work to open up the small package.
Max will use a Dyson in order to place a pitcher on which he'll use in order to mix the fruit. Max will use this grip spoon in order to mix the materials within. Max will also use the Dyson in order to put a cutting board on which he'll use this rocker knife in order to cut the fruit. In order for Max to read the recipe, we're going to place it in a round card holder and use the magnifying light to enhance his ability to read.